The experimental experiences are preparing us for everything. Well, what's an experimental experience? Well, I think every experience is experimental. I feel most of the time, especially when I'm doing something new, that I'm experimenting, that I'm making, like I'm dipping my toe in the water to see how hot or cold it is. I feel like that's what's happening in almost everything I do in life, that I'm learning as I'm going along, that I'm trying to just figure it out as I'm doing it. I guess they do say the best way to learn something is to just jump right in and do it. So it seems like everything that we do in this life is kind of this experiment through experience. And, if you think about it, the building blocks of learning start with a question, right? You start off thinking about how, when, where, who, what. And in the process of that questioning, that's when we start to figure things out. We are essentially navigating through everything, trial and error. It's an experimental experience. So when we put it under the umbrella of an experimental experience, it doesn't make the idea of failing or stumbling feel that traumatic. It doesn't feel like that big of a deal because we acknowledge that it was an experiment to begin with, right? Every experience really is an experiment just to see how we're going to work through it, how we're going to evolve from it, how we're going to respond to it, because we don't know any of those things going in. I mean, literally, almost everything is an experimental experience. So I think about all the questions that experiences have given me the answers to. So when I don't know what to do or how to do it or where, or when, or why, I know that somewhere in the process, I'm going to figure that out, because by being in the process, by being in the act, the action, the attempt, it's going to give me an awareness that I didn't have before. And, I often say that the attempt is the first step towards success. So if there's anything we ever wanted to do, we had to make the attempt in order to make it happen. There's no coincidence that everything we have learned from before this point has prepared us for whatever it is we're doing and experiencing right now. And I joke that as I get older, it almost feels like we're discouraged from asking questions, from showing up in a place where we're eager to learn, that if we don't show up at least appearing as though we already know everything, that somehow somebody will be disappointed in our ability, that by asking questions, it's not showing enthusiasm for learning and evolving, rather than it's often perceived, or we believe it's perceived, as an indication of our ignorance, which I do not think is the case. When they tell children, well, there are no stupid questions, very rarely do they say that to adults. When's the last time you were at your job and they said, oh, there are no stupid questions, ask anything. And I think in a lot of our minds, as we get older, we think that there are stupid questions, that there are things that maybe we are better off just Googling privately rather than asking the question. And I'm sad by that, because I feel like it robs us of the connection that comes with education. We can all remember somebody who told us something that significantly changed our lives, dropped some gem of wisdom, dropped some knowledge on us that gave us an awareness that we didn't have before. And as children, we're encouraged to ask questions. Well, most of us are encouraged to ask questions, at least, until the 10th follow-up question. We're encouraged to ask questions. And certainly, if we continually ask the same question over and over and over again, then we might be discouraged from asking the question, but the burning question still remains. We still want to know. We want all the answers. We want the pieces of the puzzle to come together. And as an adult, I think we should be more vulnerable, comfortable in our vulnerability, to ask questions, to admit that we don't know. Because, I especially feel like, if there's a point where I feel like I know everything, well, then, where's the excitement in that? Where's the ability to really be stimulated by new circumstances and situations and conversations? Because if you walk into a situation thinking you know it all, there's no more room to grow and evolve. And where do you go from there? You're kind of stuck. So stepping into the role of a child and being comfortable with asking questions, knowing that a lot of the experiences that we have are really pushing us towards the answers of the questions that we initially had. And I say all that to get back into that space of being comfortable in this experimental experience that, none of us consciously have been on this journey before. Certainly, whatever you believe about past lives and evolution and reincarnation and whatever, that's a whole backstory because we're here now. And as much as we might be familiar with something, as much as we might have an innate gift for something, we are all still stumbling and learning along the way. And there's no more evidence of the fact that the universe is our university, that the people in our lives are our teachers, the circumstances are the classroom, and what we learn becomes the dissertation, really, that describes all of the hands-on research that we've done over the course of our lifetime. It's so easy to be distracted by a temporary struggle. We think that the struggle is all that exists, and we don't realize until we come out on the other side that the struggle is what prepared us for everything. So these experimental experiences are preparing us for life, preparing us to live, preparing us to be in a space where we are comfortable not knowing, but still enthusiastic about learning, evolving, growing, and gaining more knowledge from the experience. And it's kind of like writing a thesis that describes our life experience, that everything is an experimental research project, that most of our relationships, experimental research. Certainly, our journey through school where we're dabbling in different disciplines and then figuring out what we actually enjoy and hopefully pursuing that path. That it's like tasting food at a buffet, which, I'm not encouraging you to go to a buffet, but it's like experimenting, knowing that, you can take a little spoonful of everything. And then if there's something you really don't like, you don't have to eat it because you didn't take a whole lot of it. You're not wasting. You were just tasting. And I think that's what this experimental experience is. It's in a place where we're just tasting. We're taking little tastes so that we can see what we want more of, what we want to go back to the buffet to get more of. And then we can kind of isolate and identify the things that are really feeding our spirit and doing more for us. So we don't ever feel like we're in a space where what we're doing is not creating something more for us, that it's not building into an experience that's going to be significant in our lives when we look back. And that's where these experimental experiences kind of take the pressure off, where we don't feel like everything is, a life or death thing, where it's not like the world is watching, waiting for us to fail. I think the world is watching just to see how we're going to handle ourselves. How are we going to come out on the other side? And taking life, especially the struggles, especially the confrontation and the catastrophes, taking it like it's just an experiment. Like, well, how am I going to deal with this today? And what questions do I need to answer to come out on the other side where I'm improved and more knowledgeable and more aware and more evolved because of the circumstance I was in? And that's where we relieve a lot of the stress and tension that we place on ourselves, allowing it to be an experimental experience where it's not so much a pressure-driven struggle that we have expectations that we should be a certain way or show up a certain way. We don't need that. Lord knows we don't need any extra stress or pressure, because we often are placing more of it on ourselves than anyone else is placing on us. So depending on how you look at life, depending on our perspective, depending on our circumstances, every experimental experience will seem like either an opportunity or an obstacle. It can seem like the gateway that's opening doors to the infinite, or the hurdle that's slowing us down and preventing us from arriving at the destination that is our destiny. Everything is an experiment. All of the experiences, all the relationships, everything that we go through, if we just take it as an experiment, we understand that every once in a while, the experiment might fail. That every once in a while that there's something that we mix together that doesn't work out so well. And then we learn from that, and we know to change things, change the ingredients, change the circumstances, change the parameters a little the next time around and see how it goes. And I think answering the questions along the way, that gives us this gateway that does open doors to the infinite. Because the funny thing about learning is that once you learn one thing, it gives you access to understanding and awareness of other things. So this is, again, that experimental experience, that the questions usually are pretty simple. They're rooted in the who, what, when, where, why, how. And they're not meant to leave us questioning everything, but instead they're giving us access to answers. And those answers are then often leading to more questions, but the question becomes more defined, or the awareness becomes broadened, the perspective and perception broadens, so that we don't pigeonhole ourselves into thinking that things are one way, that we kind of give ourselves the freedom to have, to miss the step every once in a while, to fail in the attempt. And it's not the end of the world, it's the beginning of something else. And that's when I think life gets easier. Again, when we think we know everything, that's when things get really hard. When you walk into a circumstance or in a situation, in a relationship especially, thinking you got it all down packed, that there's nothing more to know, well, then that's when you butt heads. That's when you experience the conflict. That's when things get really hard, because it's well, if you knew everything, if you were, as aware and on top of things as you think you are, then you'd be showing up as an evolved individual. You'd be showing up, a little better. You'd be more a little compassionate, more empathetic, more connected, more emotionally available. All of the things that require us to be vulnerable and have a sense of stability and confidence that we're not going to be broken down by opening ourselves up. And as long as we remain in a perpetual state of learning, evolving, improving, then we're always flexible enough not to break when life throws those challenges our way. And remaining flexible, obviously as a yogi, remaining flexible, we understand, is more about flexibility of the mind than it ever is flexibility of the body. People look at me with my leg above my head and think, oh, well, she's just naturally flexible. They don't realize that literally it took me 15 years to get to a space where I was comfortable bringing my leg over my head. That there were times especially when I first started the practice, I couldn't even stand in a forward fold. And it took a long time for my hips to open, my hamstrings to open, my body to let me in. But first what had to happen is that my mind let me in, that I stopped thinking that there were things that were beyond my reach, that there were poses that I would never be able to do, or that the degree of flexibility that I saw around me somehow was unattainable for me. And then when I opened myself up to the possibility, and the beauty of it is, what really opened me up is that I noticed that each time I made the attempt, I got a little farther. I made a little more progress. I felt more open. I felt like literally every time I stepped on the mat that I was improving. And I think that's the validation that we all need, to know that these experimental experiences, even if they're just getting us a little millimeter closer to where we want to be, that's a huge, huge step. Because there are a lot of people that spend decades of their life, sometimes all of their life, just stuck in the same pattern, in the same space, not even giving themselves access to something brand new. So when I explain it to people, I talk about, this perpetual state of learning. And I use the analogy of being in the gym as to think about how to deal with struggle. That we have to focus on the strength that the struggle is creating. Because in the midst of the struggle, you just feel like the struggle is all that exists. And that's when we start to feel like we're breaking down, we're overwhelmed. That's when it's harder to be flexible and maintain that through the challenge, because we get very focused on just the struggle in and of itself. But thinking about what questions are being answered through the challenge. What are we learning about ourselves in that moment where the focus is the struggle, where we kind of feel like we're overwhelmed? So think about building muscles at the gym. We see people who are in great shape and we are inspired by them. And, you see somebody at the gym who, looks really healthy, looks really fit, and we think maybe watch them to see their movements, to see what's working for them, to see if it will work for us. And without that initial example, we might never even know where to start. So it's beautiful to learn from example, to learn from our teachers, knowing that we're all in this beautiful balance between being a student and teacher all the time. So we learn by example and we find the who that will inspire us. And the beauty of it is we shift from the who out there, the person that we see who maybe is doing something that we think might help us and we want to learn how to do it too. We shift our focus then from the who, looking at what they're doing, to then applying what's working for them to ourselves, to taking their strategy and applying it to ourselves. So then we step into the role of the who's actually doing the work. And then we are in the driver's seat. We take control and we're preparing ourselves. So we figure out the technique. We figure out what we want to do. Then we get to the space where we're ready to lift the weight. We have to have the belief that it's possible for us to lift that weight. We have to know how to use it to build the strength rather than maybe lifting a weight that's too heavy or doing it out of alignment so that we actually get injured in the process of lifting. So we have to identify the who, and the who becomes us because then we're in the action role. How do we approach it? And knowing that we have the ability to, and then being intelligent enough to say, hey, well, maybe let's start off with a lighter weight and build ourselves up. Because you wouldn't start lifting a weight that's too heavy or positioning your body out of alignment that could lead to injury, or at the very least case, maybe you're not even in the optimal alignment that's allowing you to achieve the maximum result from the effort we're putting in. Because what a shame would it be to go through life and think that, we're in the right alignment, we're putting in all this work, we're making all this effort, but we are not strategically positioning ourselves to achieve the maximum result from the effort that we're putting in. So then it's especially helpful, you want to know, well, what muscle group are you trying to isolate? And how can you work that muscle effectively? So we start to think about, well, the how, the who, the why, the how, and we got to understand, why it's important to strengthen that muscle. How is it going to help us gain strength overall? So you start just thinking about the muscle as any exercise in life, any experience in life, these experimental experiences. And once we know the technique, once we have the approach, we have the at least the strategy and the vision in mind for how we're going to do it, we have to know when to lift, when to hold on, when to release it, when to push harder, and when to back off. And all of these things are little experiments that are happening in the training. So we do have very clear awareness that we're training in life, that everything is this experimental experience. And we've all experienced, the pain, the frustration, the anxiety, depression that comes along with that struggle that builds strength. It's like that experience of the soreness that comes after lifting weights or after doing a new exercise that stimulates muscles that may have never been worked before. If we let that soreness or the idea or the awareness of the soreness stop us in the moment, we never build the strength. If we stopped in the moment when it was struggle to pick up the weight, if we stopped then because we're anticipating the soreness after the workout, we would never be consistent enough to build the strength. So the struggle is not meant to defeat us. The entire process of answering these questions, the what, who, when, where, and why, it's giving us the preparation to excel at everything. Everything. The experimental experience is the most effective learning tool. Think of every situation as your laboratory, that we're just mixing, matching, and mingling until we find out what's comfortable. Every once in a while, in the laboratory, there's combustion, an explosive reaction. But that's only temporary until eventually everything falls back into equilibrium. Let the laboratory be a safe space for learning. So these experimental experiences are not anything that is pushing us or fighting against us. It's actually giving us access to everything else. We set the intention to enjoy the experimental experiences that life brings so that there's never a reason to dwell in the explosive reaction, because the questions that come up are revealing the answers to everything that we need to know to attain equilibrium. So with these experimental experiences, our work is to attain equilibrium. We want to get to a space where we feel balanced, comfortable, secure, stable, all the things that give us the platform and the foundation to build. And as we, reflect on what was, as we set intentions for what will be, being aware of the lessons that we've learned along the way, knowing that we're continually learning, and that's okay, that it's actually a sign of intelligence to ask questions, that we're not just going along with the motions. We're not just along for the ride. We're driving. We're leading. We're charting the course to our destiny. And our destiny ought to be the destination all the time. So I'd like to just leave you with the feeling of comfort that should come with this experimental experience. That not taking things too hard or too seriously, that putting in the effort is worth the work. And a lot of times the effort is just in answering the questions and finding a space where we can enjoy these experimental experiences so that there's never a reason to dwell in the explosive reaction that might come when two things mix that don't mix well, when the circumstances might be confrontational, when things aren't going really well. And just know that the questions are inevitably going to reveal everything we need to know, that the experiences are leading us into a different place, that the teachers in our lives are there to help guide us one way or the other, and that we can be comfortable enough to ask when we don't know and confident enough to act when we do know. Enjoy the experimental experiences that life brings, so that there's never a reason to feel like the question or the struggle is overwhelming, that in fact it's the opposite. That as we move through this life in these experimental experiences, that inevitably and eventually we will attain equilibrium. But it often requires a few experimental experiences in order to get there. Enjoy the experiences, because that's the magic of life. That's the spice, these experimental experiences that are giving us the gateway to our destiny. Blessings, blessings, and blessings. Spoken Word Yoga. Namaste.